Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode of the award-winning All Things Investigations. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to have Sean Reilly to talk to us about a topic that's been on the front lines of a lot of business and compliance professionals over the past several months, and that is the Nippon Steel attempted purchase of U.S. Steel. So, Sean, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Looking forward to it.
Sean, could you tell us a little bit about your academic and professional background?
I undergrad at the University of Richmond. I went to law school at the University of Notre Dame. It's been a good couple of weeks for us recently. And currently the co-chair of the Hughes Hubbard export control sanctions and any money laundering practice group. And within that, we there are other national security matters, including CFIUS. Prior to joining the firm, I spent some time at the Commerce Department, and I was a policy advisor to the Secretary of Commerce, and then some interaction with CFIUS and advising the Secretary and the staff within the Commerce Department that was interacting in the CFIUS process. So within that, there's some export controls and sanctions, and also handling CFIUS filings with the committee, advice to companies that are interested in whether or not a CFIUS filing is appropriate, and those sorts of things.
Could you tell us, for the listeners who may not know or might need a refresher, what is CFIUS and what is a CFIUS filing?
Sure. So CFIUS is our interagency committee on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It is chaired by the Department of Treasury, and it's got 9 other cabinet agencies that are members, and then there's some other agencies that are ex officio members, as well as some White House offices that participate in consulting in money. And it comes from, it's authored initially by the Defense Production Act of 1950. It's been amended a number of times, but essentially it's a committee that reviews any transaction in which a foreign person is seeking to acquire a U.S. business. And the reserved grounds under which it's supposed to be reviewed is whether or not it poses a threat to national security. And for transactions where a foreign person or entity is looking to buy a U.S. business and there's a potential national security concern about that transaction, then CFIUS has the authority to review that transaction, determine whether it believes there may be national security risks, whether those risks can be mitigated, and then depending, the process can go in a number of different ways. And ultimately, if there's a concern that the risks can't be mitigated, it can be referred to the president, and the president actually has the authority on national security grounds to blank a transaction, in extraordinary cases.
So could you walk our listeners through that process of what you do? Because it's actually quite an involved process. And for a company who says, we're going to do this deal in 2 weeks, let me just fill this out, that's not going to cut it. So it's become more robust, appropriately good. But could you just walk us through that process?
Sure. So the vast majority of kind of CFIUS cases or transactions are ones that the parties can determine whether they want to make a voluntary filing to the CFIUS committee. There's a limited number of very sensitive transactions that are defined in the regulations and statute with a mandatory filings requirement. But for most transactions, if the parties believe that there may be national security concerns and that the government may have some concern about that, you can file voluntarily with CFIUS and have them review the transaction, or then give clearance to the transaction, essentially. And that happens, then the parties can take comfort that CFIUS isn't going to later come back and try to unwind the transaction. There's a number of different, there's 2 primary ways you can do it. In a case where you think the concerns are particularly high, but you just want to alert CFIUS to the transaction, there's the ability to file a short form declaration, which will then kick off a 30-day assessment period in which CFIUS can take a look at the transaction and see whether or not it has any national security concerns. If it does, then it can ask the parties to go and file the most in the end forum process, and can just cut to the chase and file what's called a notice with CFIUS. The notice process kicks off initially a 45-day review period, where CFIUS will take a look and see whether there are national security concerns that it believes to be addressed. And then during the course of that first 45-day review period, if it believes there will be a need for mitigation or if it has further questions, it can kick off a further 45-day investigation period. Typically, that's the time in which the parties will work with CFIUS on adopting some national security agreement, and that include mitigation measures to get CFIUS comfortable allowing the transaction to proceed and feeling comfortable that whatever national security concerns they have been generated.
Sean, I think I know the answer you're about to give me, but when would you advise a company to bring in specific CFIUS compliance counsel into a transaction? In the early stage and after the letter of intent's been signed, as soon as possible, all of the above, none of the above?
Yeah, I would say as soon as possible, whether it's a U.S. business that's now looking at the possibility of being acquired by a foreign company, and whether it's a foreign company that's looking to buy a U.S. business. I think at the stages you can be assessing what are the potential sensitivities from the due diligence phase when you're looking at the company that's being acquired then, is understanding whether or not there will be CFIUS issues, particularly whether a mandatory filing might be required, because you don't want to offend with those rules. But even understanding whether a voluntary filing is going to be advisable. The benefits of you do the process. You can file a voluntary filing after closing. The downside that you run there is you've closed the transaction. If there's mitigation measures that need to be taken, or worst case scenario, in the few instances where the government orders divestment, you're now left in the situation of trying to unscramble the eggs. The earlier you're in the process, understand what the CFIUS risks may be, and addressing those, the better off, because it certainly solves a lot of, or avoids a lot of problems from the line down the line.
Sean, I'd now like to turn to one of the subjects I wanted most eager to talk to you about, and that was the Nippon Steel attempted acquisition of U.S. Steel. And we could probably spend an entire podcast on U.S. Steel, what it has meant to the United States, and is one of our true great legacy corporations. But could you also give a little background to the transaction and what the CFIUS role was?
Sure. First, to just be clear that we're not involved. We don't represent any of the parties in the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel merger. And most of what I've heard is what I've learned from the public approach, as well as having looked into the recent litigation that was just filed last week. But essentially what happened was U.S. Steel was extraordinarily solicited to acquire by Cleveland Cliffs, a U.S. steel manufacturer, sometime in 2023, as part of their due diligence process that the board did, and doing its fiduciary duty and seeing what other strategic options may be available. There are a number of other bids that were made for steel, and Nippon Steel, the largest Japanese steel manufacturer in the world, one of the largest steel manufacturers in the world, ultimately ended up presenting the board of U.S. Steel with the bid that deemed to be in the best interest of the company and its shareholders. And so they signed a merger agreement in December of 2023. Though in March of 2024, they made a voluntary filing with CFIUS to have CFIUS review the transaction. And in the course of that, obviously, the presidential election and the U.S. Steel being headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and each of its operations being in Western Pennsylvania, the transaction ended up getting caught up in the political movement in Pennsylvania as early on the primaries, and kind of the ultimate swing state in the election. And so there was, a fair amount of domestic opposition to the transaction. As you mentioned, U.S. Steel's an iconic American company of the companies at the time of its founding, the early part of the 20th century. It was since sort of found Athens only the third largest manufacturer in the United States, I think 27th globally. But still U.S. Steel, and in the course of the second half of second three quarters of 2004, the CFIUS was involved in a review of the transaction. There was back and forth between the company. One thing that I'm mentioning was timelines. They've been strict 45-day deadlines for each. The parties can always voluntarily withdraw their filing and then resubmit it if they would like to give the government more time to consider the transaction. Sort of like I tell my kids, I can tell you, you can give me more time to consider it. And so in this case, the parties understanding that there seem to be continued issues and questions from the government, sought to withdraw the thing a couple of times, which is what allowed the timeline to slip until late December. I believe it was December 23rd. When the matter was sent to President Biden, and he ultimately elected to block the transaction.
So what were some of the key findings, or if not findings, concerns you saw raised by the CFIUS committee?
The biggest concerns on sort of, as I mentioned earlier, like the CFIUS is supposed to be very, very strictly confined to national security concerns that cannot be litigated by law or by an agreement through the parties. And so I think the concern that lots of people have with this are the fact that U.S. Steel, for instance, doesn't manufacture steel that's used by the Defense Department. It doesn't have the capacity to make steel that's used in battleships or so. Questioning to some degree whether or not U.S. Steel at this point is strategically necessary for actual national security measures, and sort of the broad definition of national security that CFIUS seemed to apply here. But I think the phrase they used was that it might have an impact upon Steel's decisions, maybe the negative impact on steel-making capacity generally in the United States, and whether or not, those concerns, typically the parties will agree to things like they'll keep facilities open. They put decision-making in a board of made up of U.S. persons. They'll grant CFIUS the ability to kind of veto decisions regarding shutting down capacity or closing plants. And at least according to the accounts, these were things that Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, these were assurances they were willing to provide. Now, the degree to which those assurances were excited and the government's concerns with them certainly is a matter of debate, perhaps. But the fact that the kind of backdrop when you look at the litigation that's been filed by U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel seeking to enjoin the president's action is the fact that from the earliest stages before the CFIUS review could even begin on the campaign trail, President Biden was saying he wasn't going to the transaction. Cleveland, the Cliffs CEO was out saying he was talking to the administration and was assured that the transaction wasn't going to go through. Like Steelworkers Union was out saying, have people within the administration that are throwing us, this isn't going to go through. Before that national security review could even be begun, much less completed, causes concerns and the basis for the lawsuit. Then it really didn't follow the typical CFIUS process, and then the decision was driven by something other than pure national security concerns.
What about the domesticity, if that's the right word, domicile of the target acquirer, i.e. Nippon Steel? At least since 1945, Japan has been as steadfast an ally as the United States has. So I don't think we can put them on a bad guy list, although maybe. Nevertheless, we have a company from a country who's certainly a competitor to the United States, no doubt about that, but a political ally and a strategic ally. Do you think this decision sort of puts the domicile wherever the company is headquartered really in play, as opposed to a country that we might agree is a political or strategic adversary of the U.S.?
I'd say, like, I guess the best way to say it is, I don't think it puts it more in play. It just means it's not necessarily the kind of get out of jail free card that you might expect it would be, right? So in this case, where it's a politically charged and an unfortunate timing, there's a number of different factors that you might be able to look in and say, look, if it was called, if Andrew Carnegie had named it Andy's Steel Company instead of U.S. Steel, so it didn't have that same visceral reaction, might the result be different? If it wasn't in Pennsylvania, if it wasn't an election year, but things are probably the bigger competitors. They wouldn't necessarily be telling Japanese clients, Japan is looked at differently than it was a year ago. Look at this would be essentially this. There's only been 7 transactions where the president actually taken with the CFIUS authority. There's been 9 transactions in which the president has actually taken such action to stomach the the transaction. 7 of those were Chinese entities or Chinese backed companies. And there was a Singapore company, high-tech funding, but there were also concerns about Chinese influence. This is the first one that this has happened, and it's been other than where those primary concerns were. And of China, as you said, though, it's just it's a steadfast ally. And then it is certainly concerned. I think it's part of the reason when, at least when you see the press reporting, the State Department seemed to be concerned with this approach. It seemed like the objections weren't coming from the Department of Defense. There was some reporting that suggests within the White House, the foreign policy, national security advisors were looking for ways to make this transaction happen because of our relationship in large part with Japan. There was others that were on the political legacy side of things that motivated more of and the idea that making sure that President Biden's reputation as being pro-union was something that was being protected. It's an important case, and it's something we're following certainly as the litigation goes on, and to see how it's handled in the next administration. I do think it's worth being a little bit. Not overreacting in the sense of saying that this is some sea change in the way we're looking at investments from the ways in the way that other cases would be evaluated that don't have some of these same kind of tangential issues that unfortunately don't go directly towards national security concerns.
Sean, let me change the focus just a little bit and ask you to look down the road a little bit. And what does this mean for the CFIUS counsel, for the general counsel of a large corporation, or really anyone who would be involved in this process? Are there questions you and your team are fielding from clients or potential clients? Are there advice you're giving now? Or really, what should the CFIUS compliance practitioner be thinking about for advice for their clients?
Yes, I think the first one was, as I was alluding to there, is I wouldn't sort of overreact. Other companies and other situations, this will be the exception that kind of proves the rule. By and large, the CFIUS stamp and the CFIUS process is extremely professional. And they are very practical and dedicated professionals that really do focus on, in my experience, the real issues, and they have an appreciation for it. The benefits of foreign direct investment. They're looking for ways to be able to make sure that they're addressing the national security concerns, but they understand the enormous impact that foreign investors have on jobs, innovation, and that foreign direct investment is something. And when I was in the Commerce Department, we stood at the first office to try to promote foreign direct investment. It was picked up by subsequent administrations, and continued to be, to be enhanced. The U.S. is still looking and interested in foreign direct investment. So I wouldn't overreact. I do think it's worth always being considering, not just in your own mind. And if you're the company, it's very easy to look at your transaction and say, oh, but this doesn't apply to us. We know there's not a foreign, or there's not a national security concern here. And to talk through it and say, well, okay, I understand, but you understand that your business is involved in these areas. CFIUS might have a question about that. They may be concerned with the data that you're collected. They may be concerned with your products and the impact it has on critical infrastructure, whether it's, whether it's an emerging technology. But at the very least, let's maybe consider filing a voluntary declaration and explain to them why it is that this is a transaction that they don't need to be concerned with, because if you can, present that to them, evaluate it effectively and fairly, then you've got a safe harbor. Well, they're not, you don't have to worry about them coming back 3 years later and saying, we found out you did this deal and we have concerns about it. But they may be looking at it a little bit more skeptically because there wasn't a voluntary filing. I think those are the sorts of things that, I would have advised a year ago in clients to think about and to consider and continue to advise on. And then also always being sensitive to that political aspect, right? It is, okay, is there some reason why a local congressman might have concerns with this that might draw extra attention to it? How is this going to be presented in the media? What stakeholders can you get on board early on so that you don't get things get spun up where it's like, by golly, this is a U.S. company and why is somebody else buying them? I'm old enough to remember the battles in the 80s when people got spun up about the Japanese buying their Senate and Pebble Beach, and it was like, well, what are they going to do with it? They're not taking to Japan. They're not going to. But I understand that there are these political concerns, and once they get things going, then it's hard to keep everybody sort of on track and focused on it with the eye on the prize. That really what the only concern, at least within the CFIUS context, should be is national security and what can be done if there are legitimate national security concerns to address those. And if possible, the transaction to go forward.
Sean, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you, if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out more information about Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed, or your practice, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
Sure, you can get Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed website. It's HughesHubbard.com is a good place to find me. And then also I'm available on LinkedIn and welcome to connect with people there as well. Either way is a good way to reach out to me.
Sean, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Sean, as I mentioned in the introduction to your podcast, we've had some new developments under the Trump administration around the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel transaction. So I ask if you would take some time to visit with us about what has happened over the past literally few days. So what have you seen happen, and more importantly, how should a CFIUS counsel like yourself or a company start to think about this process going forward?
Yeah, I think one thing we'll all need to be thinking about across all the work streams that we work in is things are going to be developing rapidly for us in this new world. But yes, since we recorded just last week, President Trump, I guess on last Thursday, met with the CEO of U.S. Steel, and then the following day on Friday, he met with Prime Minister Ishida of Japan. And coming out of the meeting with the Prime Minister and the press availability thereafter, President Trump announced that there had been some sort of an agreement reached whereby Nippon Steel would invest in U.S. Steel and would transfer significant technology into U.S. Steel, but would not actually acquire U.S. Steel, and that they would therefore allow this investment to move forward. My understanding is that the CEO of Nippon Steel is visiting them this coming week, and to work out some of the details. And but it now looks like at least some transaction will be allowed to go forward. I think in terms of like ways to think about it, one, what's interesting is this is the type of sort of mitigation agreement that you would expect and does typically work its way out in the CFIUS process normally, where during the investigation phase, the parties will work with CFIUS to determine like what is a way that this could go forward where the parties are comfortable with what the transaction still looks like from a business perspective, but the national security risks are addressed. And to the extent here, the national security risks that were identified were the ability for Nippon Steel to direct U.S. Steel in certain trade remedies, litigation, or actions, and sort of undermine U.S. Steel's role in trying to work with the rest of the U.S. steel industry or American steel industry on trade remedies related to steel. If that was the concern, then reorganizing the transaction in some way would address those. And unfortunately, against the backdrop of the 2024 election, that wasn't, I guess, a viable option. And when you look at some of the media reporting and the litigation that's out there, there were suggestions that CFIUS just wasn't willing to engage in these discussions leading up to the election and then leading up to the decision to block it earlier this year. But that these are exactly the sorts of things that might be a way for parties to move forward with a transaction that does raise national security concerns. For company moving forward, I think there's a couple of things. Is one that's just sort of highlights what the CFIUS process can and should look like, and what some of the possible outcomes are that would allow even sensitive transactions to move forward. But I also think that, and then some of the other recent events in the last 2 weeks just show that there's tremendous amount of authority that's been granted to or delegated to the president by Congress to take certain actions in national security issues broadly, defined. And so I think companies and their compliance officers just need to be aware of that and be willing to engage and address the changes as they come around. And expect, that things are going to be rapidly evolving.
Sean, it's a little known part of my practice, but I actually do contracts work. I don't talk about it very often, but I enjoy it. And one of the things I enjoy is sitting across the table or virtually across the table from a colleague and trying to work out contracts so that our respective clients can move forward in a business transaction. And so I love the give and take. And I've evolved to sort of questions like, what can I do to make you comfortable? Where do you need to be to get to a comfortable place that you can agree to something that I really need? Are those the types of conversations that you would have with CFIUS, or at least you could put forward to CFIUS? What can we do to make you comfortable? Or do you need to come to CFIUS with a proposal and then they'll perhaps consider it?
No, it very much is a give and take. Often it's CFIUS that comes first with a proposal and says, look, this is what we think we need to be comfortable. And then the parties to the transaction will look at, based on the business realities, what really works for the nature of their business. And there is a give and take where you say, okay, I understand this is your concern. You CFIUS have proposed a particular solution to it. The problem is to make sense from a business perspective of these business operations and functions that would be complicated in a manner that no longer makes it a good transaction. Can do it this way, and does that work for you? And that's sort of the way the process works, is to sort of an iterative process to try to figure out what's something that makes CFIUS comfortable, that their national security concerns are completely addressed, and that this transaction is not going to undermine the security of the United States, but that the parties to the transaction still see it as a good business deal.
In the part one, I'm going to call it now, this podcast. I posed the question to you, was the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel transaction anomalous within the context of CFIUS? And we had a discussion about, because of a variety of factors, incredibly unique to the situation, the timing, the location, the personalities involved, et cetera. It maybe moved towards something, if not anomalous, a little bit different that or outside the usual. Can I ask you now, does this move by the president really move it sort of back from anomalous to almost not a standard CFIUS transaction, because a lot of very high level people were involved, but at least the process was more standard?
Yeah, I think the process was still incredibly non-standard.
Okay.
I think the outcome, you could say, has now gotten to the place where CFIUS reviews literally hundreds of cases a year that you never hear anything about. It's a confidential process. It never makes the news because all of these things are worked out behind closed doors, and the parties get comfortable with it. The transaction goes forward, and nobody may have ever known CFIUS was involved in it. And if this weren't such a politically charged, and the timing, the location, all of those sorts of things weren't the way they were, this very well could have played out that way. The transaction goes forward and no one even knows CFIUS was involved. So I think the process is still just an outlier. What now is more kind of similar to what you see in most cases is the fact that there was a resolution that is apparently going to allow the parties to go forward. As I mentioned before, in the history of CFIUS, there's really only been 8 transactions. No, we were talking about 9, but 8 transactions that had been blocked or otherwise unwound after the fact because of CFIUS issues. And this now goes back into that hopper of, at least outcome-wise, is much more typical of what happens in CFIUS.
Well, what I'd then like to end on is the following, which is a maxim I talk about a lot, that as lawyers, we are only limited by our collective imaginations. And it seems like to me that lawyers and a lot of others in this transaction use their collective imaginations to get to the end point that at least we're discussing in this addendum.
Exactly. That's always our goal, was to look at all the options, make sure that we haven't left anything off the table, and figure out what's the best way we can resolve an issue for the client so that they can go forward with their business, also addressing whatever legal concerns might apply.
Well, Sean, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to do this addendum. We're recording this on Super Sunday. This is great. This is the first time I've ever had an addendum. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Tom.